Western Pride 15, Sunshine Coast Fire 1. South Melbourne 9, Dandenong Thunder 0. Bayswater 7, Joondalup United 0. Hello and welcome to round 3 of the Pecking Order Show, a show where we talk about the struggle for supremacy in Australian football, everything from the serious to the ridiculous. Now I've got the ridiculous stuff well and truly covered, but the serious stuff I'm going to need some help, and I've got my brother Jake on the line on Skype. Jake, how are you going this evening?
Excellent, thank you, Cody, and I'm glad to hear you say that you're on the ridiculous end.
Yep, awesome. Now guys, before we jump into round 3, I want to let everybody know about the Pecking Order Weekly Roundup that we'll be putting together. We've put together our first one this week. Jake's been compiling all this data together every week for us to use on the show. We've got graphs, heaps of data. We've got the top 200 rankings. We've got the results from each of the top leagues around the country, predicted league tables and predictions for the upcoming weekend's games. Now, basically, we don't want to go to waste, so Jake came up with the idea that we polish it up and put it together as a downloadable PDF for free for you guys. Now, our website is still under construction, so for now you can get it by entering your email on our Facebook page. So go to TPO Rankings on Facebook. Obviously, you should be following us anyway. On the left-hand side menu, you'll see the words email, sign up, weekly roundup. Yeah, email, sign up, weekly roundup. Click on that, enter your email, and you'll be on the list to receive the roundup PDF each week. For the time being, guys, these instructions only work on desktop computers or laptops, not on your mobile. So if you're watching this on your mobile, just jump over to your computer to do that. All right, enough preamble, on with the show. So in round 3 of the Pecking Order Show, we'll be talking state and league comparisons. So which NPLs around the country and which states are the strongest. We also have a new TPO championship holder, a TPOC holder of Australia. We'll be having a look at some of the blowout scores from around the country from the weekend's games, and of course a look at some of the coming games that pique our interest this coming weekend. So let's get started with some of the lopsided results around the country. It seems like there was an abnormally large amount of one-sided games this weekend. I don't know if it's true statistically or not, but it certainly seemed that way. Let's start with the biggest, and which was in the Queensland NPL. Western Pride beat Sunshine Coast Fire 15 goals to 1, I believe. Dylan Wenzel Hall, one of the strikers for Western Pride, scored 7 goals. Was it 7, Jake? Do you know?
Yeah, it was 7.
I'm guessing the rankings we expected Western Pride to win. So did we see much movement between these two in terms of TPO rankings, Jake?
It wasn't a huge amount. I mean, if a margin like that in terms of goals is obviously going to have an impact, but Western Pride were ranked 31st going into the game in the rankings, and Sunny Coast Fire were 166th. I think I looked at it before. So the percentage that was, I guess, probability of Sunny Coast winning that game was put before the game at about 2% chance. So there was a few points traded because of the goal margin, but not a lot.
Sure. Yeah, okay. And well, here's a few more of the game lopsided results we had. We had South Melbourne 9 v Dandenong Thunder 0 in the Victorian NPL. Over in Western Australia, Bayswater City versus, I think, is it Joondalup United? So 7-0 to Bayswater. Back in Queensland, Capalaba beat Wide Bay 7-1 in the FQPL. And in that same league, South United beat Ipswich Knights 6-0. So were there any big movements up and down the rankings out of these games, Jake?
Funnily enough, the 3 biggest results you've just mentioned there probably had the smallest impact on the rankings. So South Melbourne and Dandenong Thunder, not a huge movement for either team because they're so spread out in terms of the rankings at the moment and the points. And same for Bayswater and Joondalup United. So there was some movement, but probably not as much as maybe you'd expect with the goal difference. Sure. The other 2 games there, Capalaba beating Wide Bay by 7-1 and South beating Ipswich 6-0. They were a bit closer on the rankings, so it was expected to be a closer game. So there was a bit of movement there. I think South's moved up about 5 spots, and Capalaba went up about 7 on the rankings themselves with those 2 results.
Yeah, cool. So while we're on the results, it appears we have a new TPOC holder. And for all those who are wondering what the hell a TPOC is, it's the Pecking Order Championship. You can check out last week's episode. We fully explained it there. So, but yeah, it looks like we've got a new champion, Jake.
We do. So as we kind of went through last week, it's the champion at the time was Sydney up until this weekend, and they remain the champion until they lose and hadn't lost since November. So they've held it for a long time. Newcastle, with their gutsy 2-1 win with most of the game with 10 men, become the new champion and the 48th club to ever be the champion. So they've never held it before. So the Sydney's long reign is over, and Newcastle now, their next game I think is against Wellington in a couple of weeks' time. So that'll be the next title match.
Imagine if Wellington win that, bottom of the table, and take the TPOC.
Yep, it could happen.
Could happen. Well, we got a lot to get through this show, so let's sort of move on. We'll be recapping the results from around the country in that document, guys, the weekly roundup. So again, get on that one on the Facebook page and sign up with your email. Let's get to NPL or league and state comparisons. So Jake, recently you shared a graph or an image on our social media sites comparing the leagues and the states around the country. It looked interesting, but I'll admit a little confusing for my simple brain, and maybe there's some other simple people out there as well. Would you be able to explain sort of what this graph is all about?
I'll try, and it's kind of interpreting it's a bit subjective anyway, but essentially what we're trying to do, or the reason it came about, is we're trying to answer the question, or provide an answer to the question of which is the best state footballing-wise in the country.
Which is a pretty heated. In the past on Facebook, we've had quite a few comments going back and forth about New South Wales and Victoria. Which clubs are better than others, which leagues are stronger than others. So it's quite a hotly contested question, I suppose. Which is what we love here at the Pecking Order. Exactly,
and at the end of the day, we're all about just discussing the issues. So we're not going to give a black and white answer, but we'll hopefully add to the discussion. So
sure.
At this point, I guess to try and explain it a little bit, we'll get the image up on the screen so you can see what we're talking about. And like you said, there's a bit going on. So firstly, just to give you some context, so each of the bars, so there's a few different colours, but ignore those for a minute. The bar itself represents a single league. And then they're colour-coded beyond that. So A-League is Tier 1 in Australia, the yellow. The blue is Tier 2, which is your NPLs around the country. And then the kind of pinky colours, Tier 3 for some of the states. And Northern Territory has an asterisk because it's not technically part of the NPL, but I forced it in there just for comparison's sake. The bars, essentially, how we get them, what they're made up from, is we look at all of the clubs that are in a particular league. We look at the TPO rankings and say, well, what are their points? And then we add them up and do some averages. And for the more statistical-minded people, we look at standard deviations and some other stuff. But I'm happy to get into it if people have questions.
Settle down.
Exactly, but I won't go into it here. But essentially, if you look at the bars and what they mean, the high point of a bar says that's roughly, or on average, where the higher ranked clubs are sitting. And the lower part of a bar is obviously where the average of the lower clubs are sitting. So the higher the bar, I guess one way to look at it is the stronger the league. And the bars move constantly, so every game impacts it to some degree. The games where we have clubs between different states and different leagues have the bigger impact. So that's why, me personally, I love the FFA Cup, I love the NPL Championships, because it has such a big impact on not only the TPO rankings, but this sort of state-by-state comparisons. So the more of those games, the better. So I guess, hopefully that gives a very brief understanding. As I say, I'm happy to answer questions. But I guess more importantly, or more interesting anyway, is what does it actually tell us, or what does it potentially mean? So I guess the first point I'd like to make is that it's constantly moving, constantly changing. And I like to think of it a little bit as a living, breathing sort of thing. And it has a bit of a life of its own. So it's never, you can't just look at it at one point in time and get the answer, because it'll change a week later.
Yeah.
And to kind of prove that, I've got a video bit of a time lapse of the graph that we've just put up on the screen, but it's a time lapse over the last 5 years, just to show how much it does change in that time.
Okay.
So we'll get that up now, and I guess as it's rolling through, keep an eye in particular on New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. In particular, as I say, they've traded places a number of times over the years, and it's quite interesting. I think the video goes for about 30 seconds, and so that's from 2013 onwards, and it's only really in about 2017, so towards the end of that short clip, where South Australia drops a little bit away. So for a long time there, they were well in the discussion with New South Wales and Victoria for the strongest, and you can see the gap between the Tier 2 league and the Tier 3 league in some states gets wider and then shrinks and those sort of things. So it's constantly moving. And like I say, because it's never final, we don't always have the answers, but it wouldn't be a very interesting discussion if we didn't pull something out of it. So I guess what we can take away a little bit is that at this point in time, you'd say that New South Wales and Victoria are the strongest NPLs in the country, and I doubt that there'd be many that dispute that.
Which, just in looking at that graph, that image there, is New South Wales slightly higher, or are they pretty well even?
It's
the highest of the high.
Yeah, very slightly higher on the high part of each of those. But like I say, it can change. I mean, New South Wales Premier League, the NPL in New South Wales starts this weekend, so just those results could change it again. And like I said, I think South Australia can probably be part of that discussion, if not at the moment. That little time lapse shows it moves pretty quickly, so a few good results in the FFA Cup can get them back up there as well. Another thing to take out of that potentially, and this isn't a new topic either, is FFA Cup allocations, and whether South Australia has enough given the performances that they've had in those competitions. In the past, or up until now, the number of allocations has been based on registered clubs in each state. If we were to start looking at the strength of each state and the clubs within it, then you'd probably feel pretty hard done by if you were from South Australia, particularly when you say they've got one and Queensland has four. Western Australia.
Does South Australia only have one spot?
Yeah, that's right. So it's potentially, it's a bit rough. I can see that changing, and it probably should.
Sure.
We'll see what happens. I guess the other things that I kind of look at and think is interesting is in terms of where the top of one of those bars is and the bottom, the wider that gap, so the bigger the bar itself, means that there's a bigger gap between the clubs at the top of that league and the clubs at the bottom. So it's a bit more lopsided, you could say. Whereas the smaller bar means that it's actually a very competitive league where all the clubs are pretty tight in terms of the strength. So as I was looking at it, it doesn't fit perfectly into this, but as a bit of a generalisation, if you look at which states have the biggest bars and therefore kind of the more lopsided tables, it's probably Queensland, Northern New South Wales, Tasmania, ACT and Northern Territory. And interestingly, those are the states that either don't have promotion relegation or haven't until very recently. Whereas those other states that have had it for a bit longer, they tend to be, or look to be, a bit more competitive, which, again, it's pretty intuitive. You'd imagine that, the clubs that aren't performing get dropped down to the league below and you give someone else a go.
Well, yeah, I mean, that 15-1 result we mentioned earlier wouldn't have happened because Sunshine Coast Fire have come, I think, bottom of the table in the last 1 or 2 seasons. So theoretically, they would have been dropped down, and the team coming up, maybe a Peninsula Power, a Rochelle Rovers, Holland Park Hawks, wouldn't have lost 15-1, I don't think. So that gap would become smaller, I presume.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what happens, and we've seen that. I mean, if anybody wants to go back and just rewatch that time lapse, you can see right towards the end, particularly for Victoria and New South Wales, as you tick over from the end of one season to the start of the next, the bars have a little shift because essentially you're taking the top 2 clubs or the top 1 club from the league below and putting them up, and you're taking the bottom club and taking it down. So there is a bit of a shift that happens at that point. And then I guess just a final one from me, obviously if you're comparing the A-League to the NPLs below it, and a lot of discussion about second tier or national second divisions and promotion relegations and those sort of things, and I won't go into it because you won't get me to stop, and for anyone that follows me on Twitter, you'll know my views on a lot of this, but I think it's fair to say, on one hand, maybe that gap between the A-League and the NPL, at least Victoria and New South Wales, is probably not as big as what some people might expect. Particularly because you're talking about a fully professional league compared to semi-professional. But I guess on the other hand, there is a gap. And as I say, regardless of your views, I guess a second division would probably fit pretty nicely in there to help bridge that gap and kind of get
Sure.
a bit more of a flow between that from a player development point of view.
Yeah,
So,
cool.
those are things that kind of interest me and jump out. I mean, Cody, I'd like to see if there's anything else that kind of jumped out at you, but same for the listeners. As I said, it comes down to interpretation, and I'm sure I've missed something of interest. So
No, I've always been interested in that sort of, well, not always, but the last few years in that question, especially when the FFA Cup has come into play, and thinking, well, which teams are the strongest around the country, which leagues are the strongest. We're both based up here in Queensland, and I've always been wondering, where are the teams here based? How are they matched against the teams from the rest of the country? And this goes some way to answering those questions. And I think the more years of FFA Cup and the more games we have between the states, I suppose these graphs will be more accurate and become more interesting over time.
Yeah, exactly right. The more games that are played, the better for any of these sort of analyses.
Yeah, cool. Okay, let's go on to sort of the final segment of round 3 of the Pecking Order show. Upcoming games for the weekend. I've just noticed you've picked 3 and you've picked 2 of the same as me. So let's get those out of the way first. I believe Bentleigh Greens versus Pascoe Vale. Bentleigh Greens currently 12th on the rankings. Heidelberg being the only other non-A-League team higher in the rankings. They come in quite firm favourites against Pascoe Vale, team who have started the season really strongly with 2 good wins, and they're 22nd on the rankings. You got anything to add to that one?
I guess the only other thing, like I say, they're both kind of in the top 25, which indicates a good game. Bentleigh Greens are current TPOC holders in Victoria, so as I said, we covered that last week, but I jumped on that one, and both predicted to at least make the finals, if not be in contention. So, yeah.
I believe the other game, so the New South Wales NPL kicks off this weekend. We've both picked this game here, Manly versus APIA Leichhardt. Huge game. APIA, I think, are ranked 15th, Manly 17th, so not a lot between these two. I don't know recruitment over the off-season, if they've lost players, picked up players, coaching, staff, anything like that. I have no idea. But in terms of the rankings from last year, it looks to be a great opening round game. Anything to add there, Jake?
Well, it's also a grand final replay from last year. So
okay.
APIA had a brilliant season last year and would have been disappointed that they didn't take away the championship at the end there. Manly got up in the final. So, yeah, just a bang of a game to get us kicked off.
Okay, my third game. I've picked Lions up here in the Queensland NPL versus Western Pride. So both teams sitting on 9 points. Both teams considered themselves, I'm sure, title contenders. Top 2-3 at the very least. Lions in at 40th on the rankings, so they're doing quite well. Western Pride 31st, obviously coming off a 15-1 win. Bit of a training match, I guess, on the weekend. Western Pride go into its slight favourites, even though they are away from home. I think it's a bit of a local derby. Western Pride from Ipswich, Lions sort of Richlands, which is more getting towards Ipswich. So yeah, it should be a cracker. Jake, what's your third game?
I've also gone to the Queensland NPL for my third game, and it's Gold Coast United against Olympic FC.
Why have you picked that one?
It's basically down to Olympic and the season, or the start that they've had to the season. So they're 5 wins from 5. They've beat a couple of the other top teams, and they are the TPOC holders there. So I'm interested to see how far they can take it, this perfect start to the season.
Awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, there you go, guys. Round 3 done and dusted. Guys, if you are enjoying this show, even a little bit, please give us a like and a share on Facebook. It does help us reach new audiences, which is what we kind of want to get going here. And if you're watching on YouTube, the subscribe button, so you'll see each show each and every week. Jake, thanks very much for joining me.
Not a problem, Cody. Thank you.
Cool, and thanks everyone for watching at home. Any questions, as always, leave them in the comments section below, and see you next week.